History remembers her as a queen, but she began as a servant, a shadow among the royal halls of 6th century Neustria. Her beauty disarmed kings. Her cunning destroyed dynasties. She slept with her stepson, murdered queens, and turned the Merovingian court into a theater of blood. Behind every royal birth, a corpse. Behind every coronation, a whisper of poison. Her name was Fredegund, a woman so ruthless that even death feared her vengeance. This is not myth. This is recorded horror, written by trembling monks who dared to remember her crimes. Tonight we walk through the ruins of her kingdom and uncover the story of how a servant girl became the most feared woman in medieval Europe. In the dim corridors of the Merovingian palace, where whispers carried more weight than prayers, a servant girl named Fredegund learned the language of power. She was born to obscurity, a maid to Queen Ottovera, wife of King Chilperic, the first of Neustria. But even then, there was something in her gaze, sharp, deliberate, dangerous. Chroniclers described her not as beautiful in the pure sense, but as a creature whose eyes promised both salvation and ruin. She understood her world early. Men ruled through crowns, women through cunning. In the candlelit chambers of Soissons, Fredegund began her ascent, not through virtue, but through precision. Every gesture, every smile, every secret overheard was stored like a weapon. She was a student of survival in a court where affection was a death sentence and loyalty a mask. Chilperic, the king, was a man of appetite, gluttonous for food, power, and flesh. When his gaze finally fell upon Fredegund, it was not chance. She had made herself visible, yet untouchable, the perfect temptation. Their first encounter was whispered about for decades. The servant became mistress, and the queen became disposable. Fredegund's manipulation was not mere seduction. It was strategy. She whispered poison into Chilperic's ear about Ottovera's supposed disobedience, her hidden sins, her unworthiness before God. Soon, the king's affection curdled into contempt. Fredegund did not simply desire the throne. She dismantled the woman who sat upon it. The court watched in silence as Queen Ottovera was dismissed, stripped of her jewels, and confined. Her children were scattered, pawns broken before they could even speak. The former maid now walked through marble corridors draped in royal silk. Her transformation was both admired and feared, for it exposed a truth every noble woman knew but never spoke. In the Merovingian world, bloodlines mattered less than manipulation. The monks who later chronicled her life wrote with disgust, calling her a demon in woman's flesh. Yet beneath their pious outrage lay an unspoken awe. For Fredegund had achieved what few women in that brutal age could. She had rewritten her destiny through sheer will and cruelty, but her rise came at a price. The court was a nest of serpents, and every ascent required another's fall. Fredegund could not afford sentiment. Servants who knew her secrets vanished. Ladies who mocked her were found dead in their chambers. Even the priests who hesitated to bless her marriage found themselves reassigned or missing. When Chilperic finally took her as queen, he did so amidst murmurs of divine punishment. The bells of Soissons rang not with joy, but with foreboding. The people spoke of omens, a blood-red moon, a plague of crows circling the palace roofs. But Fredegund only smiled. The servant had become sovereign. The girl who once scrubbed the queen's floors now slept in her bed. And somewhere in the depths of the palace, Ottovera, dethroned and disgraced, prayed that her replacement would bring ruin to all of Neustria. She was right. Power, once tasted, demands sacrifice. For Fredegund, the crown was not a symbol. It was a weapon, and weapons must be sharpened with blood. Queen Ottovera still lived, though stripped of her title. Her presence was an echo of humiliation, a ghost the new queen could not tolerate. To Fredegund, Ottovera's existence was a daily reminder that her throne rested on stolen vows. But to the people of Neustria, Ottovera was still beloved. That made her dangerous. So the queen began to weave her first web of death. It started with a baptism, the most sacred of Christian rituals. When Autovera's child was born, Fredegund sent her a deceptive invitation. It would please the king, she wrote, if the former queen attended the baptism of her daughter. But in Merovingian law, a mother who lifted her own child from the baptismal font was forbidden to live in the same house. It was a religious taboo, punishable by exile. Fredegund ensured that Autovera committed this sin under the eyes of the clergy. The next morning, soldiers arrived. The former queen was dragged from her bed and taken to a secluded chamber. Chroniclers differ on the method of her death. Some claim strangulation, others say she was forced to drink poison. But all agree on one thing: Fredegund watched. Her expression never changed. The servant girl who once knelt before Autovera now looked upon her corpse with the calm detachment of a monarch fulfilling divine justice. It was not the act of passion, it was the perfection of control. Yet Autovera was not the only ghost that haunted Fredegund's path. The king's mistress, Basina, once the pride of his affections, still breathed. Basina's beauty and wit had drawn the king before Fredegund's ascent, and in the gossip-filled courts of Neustria, beauty was a weapon sharper than steel. Fredegund struck again. This time it was public. Under charges of sorcery, the most convenient accusation of the age, Basina was dragged through the streets, her hair torn, her body beaten by the crowd that Fredegund's spies had stirred into frenzy. She was executed at the city gates, her body left to rot as warning to any woman who dared remember the king's past. With each death, Fredegund's hold on Chilperic deepened. He came to fear her as much as he desired her. She would weep in his arms at night, speaking of loyalty, of divine favor, of her love for him and their children, then whisper the names of those who plotted treason. By dawn, those names would be erased from the court rolls forever. The Merovingian palace became a place of vanishing faces. No one dared speak of Autovera or Basina again. The queen's servants walked in silence, their eyes fixed on the floor, their voices lowered even in prayer. A single rumor could summon executioners. The chroniclers who survived her reign wrote that Fredegund purified her world through death. But beneath those words lay the horror of what she truly achieved. She turned the rituals of faith into instruments of murder. Baptisms, confessions, marriages all became veils for execution. The blood of 2 women had bought her peace. But peace is fragile when built on corpses. And in the cold stone corridors of Soissons, Fredegund began to sense a new kind of unease, not guilt, but hunger. She had tasted the silence that follows death, and she found it intoxicating. The servant had become the executioner, and Neustria was only beginning to bleed. The palace of Soissons no longer slept. Even in the stillness of night, its corridors murmured with fear, the quiet dread that clings to walls where too much blood has been spilled. Fredegund was now undisputed queen, but the crown sat heavy on her head. For every rival she had buried, another seemed to rise. Smaller, weaker perhaps, but dangerous in one unchangeable way. They were children, the heirs of King Chilperic. Some were Autovera's, some from other mistresses, and a few, fragile and feverish, her own. In the Merovingian world, lineage was a sword, and every son a potential usurper. To secure her power, Fredegund began a campaign that history still struggles to name, part madness, part calculation, entirely human in its terror. The chronicles speak in fragments: infants dying suddenly, midwives dismissed, wet nurses disappearing. Some said the queen's chambers smelled faintly of bitter almonds, the scent of poison. Others whispered that she practiced pagan rites at night, murmuring over small bones wrapped in silk. Whether myth or truth, the pattern was undeniable. One by one, the king's children perished. Chilperic was distraught, yet blind. He saw his wife weep beside the tiny coffins, her hands trembling as she kissed their foreheads. "God tests me," she whispered to him. He believed her. But those who served her, Those who had seen the stillness in her eyes as the infants convulsed knew otherwise. Fredegund's grief was performance perfected. Each tear she shed bought her another layer of protection. The monks who recorded her life struggled to reconcile her tenderness with her cruelty. One called her a mother whose womb bore both life and death. It was not far from truth. Even her own children were not safe from suspicion. When her infant son Theodoric fell ill, she accused his nurse of witchcraft. The woman was stripped, flogged, and burned alive before the gates of the palace. The child died the following dawn, the same hour his nurse's ashes cooled in the wind. Fredegund watched the smoke drift upward and said only, "God's justice is done." It was around this time that a strange sickness spread through the royal nursery. The surviving infants grew pale and weak, their cries fading like candlelight in a storm. Physicians dared not question the queen. One monk recorded that she ordered the nursery walls washed with holy water, and the next day, 3 children were found lifeless in their cradles. Whether she killed them all or merely let fate finish what fear had begun, no one could say. But after the last burial, something in Fredegund changed. Her mourning veils became darker, her prayers longer. Some swore she was haunted by the cries of the dead, that she often woke screaming in the night, clutching her chest, begging unseen infants for forgiveness. Others believed she felt nothing at all. The line between piety and madness blurred. Fredegund began making large donations to monasteries, commissioning masses for the souls of innocent children. It was both penance and performance, a queen trying to purchase divine silence. By the year 580, half of Chilperic's heirs were gone. The royal cradle had become a tomb. And though the king's eyes dimmed with sorrow, he never turned them toward his wife. Fredegund had won the most dangerous war of all, the war within her own bloodline. But across the Rhine, another queen was watching. And she would not forgive. Across the Rhine, in the kingdom of Austrasia, a different queen knelt in mourning, Brunhild, sister of the murdered Otto Vera. Where Fredegund had risen through deceit, Brunhild had once ruled through legitimacy and grace. But now, grief had turned her heart into steel. Her sister's death was not a rumor. It was a wound carved into her memory. Every monk, every emissary brought new whispers of the servant queen who had usurped her blood. What began as sorrow hardened into vengeance. Europe in the 6th century was a fractured world. The Merovingian kings were brothers, their kingdoms carved like flesh between them. Brunhild was married to King Sigebert I, Chilperic's elder brother, and unlike her sister, she possessed both royal blood and intellect. When news of Fredegund's crimes reached her, she vowed not to forgive, not to forget. The war between 2 women began quietly, as all wars do. Fredegund sent gifts, silks, jewels, false condolences, all poisoned with mockery. Brunhild replied with letters of cold dignity, every word a blade. Their rivalry soon infected the men who ruled them. Sigebert despised Chilperic's cruelty. Chilperic envied Sigebert's stronger rule. What began as a feud between sisters-in-law would ignite decades of bloodshed, known to history as the fratricidal wars of the Merovingians. When Sigebert marched against Chilperic, Brunhild rode beside him. The chroniclers describe her as radiant yet merciless, her armor polished like a mirror of divine wrath. Behind her banners marched thousands, knights who saw in her not just a queen, but a living judgment. She declared that Fredegund's crimes had cursed all Neustria. To her, this was not politics. It was exorcism. For a time, Brunhild's cause prospered. Sigebert's forces crushed Chilperic's army, and the king of Neustria fled into hiding with his treacherous wife. In 575 AD, victory seemed certain. Brunhild entered Paris to the sound of church bells, proclaiming divine justice fulfilled. Yet her triumph was short-lived. Fredegund was not a woman who accepted defeat. She could not match Brunhild's armies, but she could match her ruthlessness. In the shadows of the cathedral city, She found her weapon, 2 assassins, bribed with gold and absolution. They entered Sigebert's tent disguised as messengers and delivered a royal gift, a dagger driven deep into his ribs. The King of Austrasia died, gasping his wife's name. Brunhild's victory turned to horror. She was seized, humiliated, and imprisoned by the same woman who had destroyed her sister. Fredegund, triumphant, paraded her rival's downfall as divine will. "God favors the rightful queen," she said before her court, her voice dripping with venom. For months, Brunhild languished in captivity, her crown stolen, her husband dead, her child held hostage. The chroniclers record that she did not weep. "Her silence," wrote one monk, "was more terrible than curses." When she was finally ransomed by loyal nobles, she emerged changed, colder, wiser, and unbroken. Thus began a blood feud unlike any other in medieval Europe, 2 queens ruling through death, their hatred dividing a continent. Their armies would clash for generations. Their descendants would inherit not peace, but vengeance. And through it all, Fredegund's legend grew darker. To her people, she was both savior and serpent. To Brunhild, she was the embodiment of all evil that hides behind a crown. The War of Kings had ended. The War of Queens had begun. After King Sigebert's murder, Fredegund's enemies whispered that she had defeated an empire with a single dagger. But victory never brought her peace, only deeper paranoia. Enemies still lingered, both outside her walls and within her own bloodline. Among them was Merovingian, her husband's son by the murdered Queen Autovera. Merovingian was no child. He was a man of ambition, schooled in war, adored by his troops. And worst of all, he bore the name of the dynasty's founder. To Fredegund, that name was a prophecy. She could not allow it to live. But killing him outright would risk rebellion. So she chose the subtler art she knew best, seduction. Chroniclers debate whether the affair truly happened or was born from slander. Yet even the cautious historians of the age agree that Fredegund and Merovingian shared nights of strange intimacy after his return from campaign. Some describe secret meetings in candlelit halls. Others tell of a single evening when she pressed a goblet into his hand and whispered that power was a game best played between blood. What followed remains obscured by centuries of rumor. But in the spring of 577 AD, Merovingian was discovered in rebellion against his father. He declared himself rightful heir and demanded half the kingdom. Chilperic raged, calling his son, "the serpent raised in my own house." Yet Fredegund said nothing. She watched, patient, composed, as if waiting for a prophecy to fulfill itself. When the rebellion failed, Merovingian fled into sanctuary at the Cathedral of Tournai. Surrounded by clergy, he begged for mercy. Fredegund visited him there, veiled and silent. What passed between them in that dim sanctuary remains one of history's most chilling enigmas. Some say she wept, confessing love she could never show. Others claim she promised him safety. Days later, the king's men dragged Merovingian from the altar. He was confined in a monastic cell. For his soul's salvation, the decree read. Soon after, he was dead. Some chroniclers wrote that he was strangled. Others that he took his own life by her command. The truth died with him. When word reached Fredegund, she attended the funeral in black silk and ashes. Witnesses said she kissed the coffin before the court and whispered, "Sleep now, my child." The crowd trembled, for whether those words came from love or mockery, no one could tell. Her husband, King Chilperic, began to fear her then. He had lost his son, yet dared not accuse his queen. To do so was to risk becoming her next victim. And so he turned inward, taking solace in the church, praying that his sins might one day outweigh hers. But the god of Neustria seemed deaf. Fredegund had crossed a line even the brutal Merovingian world rarely dared: the betrayal of blood sanctified by lust. Whether the affair was fact or invention, it reshaped her legend forever. From that moment on, The monks wrote of her not as woman or queen, but as Jezebel reborn, a figure of divine punishment sent to remind kings that love and damnation often share the same bed. In the silence that followed Meroving's death, the palace seemed to breathe differently, as if the stones themselves recoiled. Fredegund's hunger had devoured her past. Now it turned toward her throne. By 584 AD, King Chilperic I of Neustria ruled a realm drenched in suspicion. The wars with his brother had drained his coffers. The assassinations within his own palace had drained his soul. The once boastful monarch, called the Nero and Herod of his time, had grown wary of his queen. He had reason to be. Fredegund moved through the corridors like a ghost dressed in crimson. The courtiers bowed to her, but none met her gaze. They whispered that she now ruled in her husband's name, that his decrees were merely echoes of her will. Chilperic began to realize what others already knew. He was no longer king, only a shadow beside the throne. Their marriage had decayed into silent warfare. He accused her of witchcraft, of poisoning his counselors, of draining his treasury for bribes and assassins. She denied nothing. A queen must defend her realm, she told him coldly, even from her husband. That answer sealed his fate. In the autumn of that year, the royal court traveled to Chelles, near Paris. The king, restless and weary of conspiracy, rode out alone one evening after Vespers. The chronicles say he wished for solitude, to escape the stench of fear that hung over his household. But as twilight fell, so did the trap. In a lonely passage between the woods and his hunting lodge, unseen figures emerged from the shadows. Chilperic was struck down, stabbed with daggers so swiftly that not even his guards heard him cry out. The attackers vanished into the dusk, leaving the king bleeding among the fallen leaves. By the time his men found him, his crown lay in the dirt beside his hand. The next morning, Fredegund appeared before the court in tears. She tore her veil, called upon the saints, and swore vengeance against the cowards who had murdered her lord. Yet none believed her grief. Every noble in attendance knew that Chilperic's greatest enemy had been sleeping beside him for years. The monk Gregory of Tours, who despised her, recorded the moment with bitter clarity. The king was slain by the command of his wife, who hid her crime beneath a veil of mourning. Even the clergy hesitated to speak her name aloud afterward, fearing that curses might follow. Fredegund now stood alone at the summit of power, a widow, a murderer, and a mother to an infant heir, Clotaire II. The regency was hers by right. Yet her throne was built upon the corpse of a king, and the kingdom knew it. Assassins began to stalk her in return. Twice she escaped attempts on her life. Once she was nearly struck down during mass, the blade glancing off her jeweled girdle. She responded not with fear, but with fire. Her first act as Queen Regent was to execute half the palace guard. Her second was to double the taxes, ensuring the loyalty of mercenaries and spies. Her third was to have the king's personal physician burned alive, a symbolic execution, for he had been the only man trusted to touch the king's body. Thus began the reign of Fredegund alone, the widow who wept for the man she had likely slain. The people of Neustria said the heavens wept blood that night. The rain turned the palace courtyard red, and the crows would not leave the towers until dawn. Fredegund had claimed her final prize, but now she would rule a kingdom haunted by her own sins. Fredegund's rule began not with a coronation, but with a purge. The palace that had once echoed with flattery now rang with screams. At dawn, the courtyards of Soissons filled with the smoke of executions, nobles, guards, servants, even children who had carried whispers through the halls. Fredegund called it cleansing. Others called it madness. Every death seemed to make her calmer. She presided over trials that were not trials, nodding to her soldiers as they dragged her enemies to the scaffold. "Loyalty," she told her son's nurse, "is not born, it is enforced." The nurse never spoke again. Her cruelty became legend. In one tale, she ordered a servant girl flayed alive for laughing during Mass. In another, she forced a suspected trader's wife to drink molten gold, calling it a fitting end for one who loved wealth too much. These stories spread across the Frankish lands, staining her name darker than any ink could. But cruelty alone could not hold a kingdom. Her enemies multiplied like shadows at dusk. Guntram of Burgundy, her late husband's brother, refused to recognize her child as heir. Brunhild of Austrasia, her lifelong rival, swore vengeance. Even the church recoiled, hesitant to bless a throne built on such terror. So Fredegund turned to fear as her weapon and shield. She built a network of spies that reached into every monastery, every noble estate, every market square. Men vanished in the night, their bodies found in rivers or never found at all. Those who survived learned to lower their voices when speaking her name. Her court became a theater of deception. Musicians played softly while daggers hid beneath their sleeves. Priests blessed her child while praying for her death. And through it all, Fredegund watched, unblinking, tireless, haunted by a silence only she could hear. For in her private chambers, guilt whispered like wind through a cracked door. She often dreamed of Chilperic, not as the man she killed, but as the husband who once adored her. In her dreams, he stood at the foot of her bed, blood on his throat, crown in his hands, asking, was it worth it? She would wake drenched in sweat, clutching the child beside her as if to prove the murder had meaning. To the world, she remained iron, yet beneath the silken venom, a mother's desperation pulsed. Her son, Clotaire too, was all she had left of power and purpose. She guarded him like a relic, never letting him out of her sight. Rumors said she even poisoned his nursemaids, fearing they might steal him away. Years passed. Her armies bled the land dry, her assassins silenced every whisper, but the specter of Brunhild grew ever closer. Two queens, one crowned in cruelty, the other in vengeance, moved their pieces across a blood-stained board. Europe watched, breathless. By the 590s, Fredegund had turned Neustria into a fortress of terror. No man dared speak without blessing himself first. Chroniclers of the age called it the reign of the she-wolf. But even wolves grow old. One winter night, as frost crawled along the stained glass of her chapel, Fredegund knelt before the altar and murmured, I have outlived them all. Behind her, the candles flickered violently, one went out. And in the silence that followed, she heard the distant cry of her own child. It was the only sound that ever truly frightened her. For the queen who had defied kings, gods, and fate itself was beginning to feel time tightening its noose. The battle between Fredegund and Brunhild was not fought only with swords. It was waged with betrayal, poison, and the slow decay of kingdoms. Across the fractured lands of the Franks, two widowed queens turned Europe into a chessboard of blood. For years, Brunhild had vowed vengeance for every death Fredegund had caused, her husband, her sons, her allies. She ruled Austrasia like a blade cloaked in velvet, patient, deliberate, watching as Fredegund's paranoia consumed Neustria from within. To the outside world, it seemed like divine justice, a slow punishment for the woman who had turned motherhood into murder. Fredegund, however, was no longer the seductress of old. She had become something colder, harder. Her beauty was gone, but her cunning had sharpened into something near demonic. She spoke of loyalty but trusted no one. Every night, she burned incense before the relics of saints she had once mocked, as though bargaining with heaven itself to protect her throne. The chronicles tell us that in 592, the first great blow fell. Fredegund led her army against Brunhild's son, Chilperic II. Chroniclers claim she rode into battle dressed in the armor of her slain husband, her hair bound beneath a blood-red veil. Her sword named Justice. Behind her marched soldiers who feared her more than death itself. She was no longer simply a queen. She was vengeance made flesh. But the war was not kind to her people. Fields burned, Monasteries were looted, and famine followed the armies like a ghost. The dead rotted in rivers that once fed the towns. Children played with the bones of soldiers. In the chaos, the once great Frankish realm decayed into a wasteland of corpses and ash. Fredegund's victories were brief and brutal. She crushed Chilbert's forces at Droisi, but her triumph came at a price: thousands dead, her generals turning against her, and whispers that even God had abandoned Neustria. Yet she stood upon the battlefield, her sword dripping red, and declared, "Let the angels weep. I am still queen." Brunhild's revenge, however, was patient. She did not strike with armies alone, but with corruption and rumor. She spread tales that Fredegund had murdered her own children, that she practiced witchcraft and consorted with demons. Priests in Austrasia preached her damnation from the pulpit. Every sermon became a weapon, every prayer a curse. And still, Fredegund endured. Her final years were marked by a strange silence, the silence of a woman who had outlived her enemies yet knew her doom crept closer. Her health failed, her once fierce eyes dimmed. The assassins she once commanded now waited for her death like vultures circling an old wolf. In 597, as war and pestilence ravaged her land, Fredegund's heart finally began to fail. On her deathbed, surrounded by priests who feared her even as they prayed, she whispered of the crimes she had buried beneath her crown. "They will remember me," she said, her breath faint as a dying flame, "but not for what I was, only for what I became." She died that night. The candle beside her bed burned until dawn, its wax pooling like blood on stone. When news reached Brunhild, she crossed herself and murmured, "Even devils must die." But deep inside she knew, one day, she too would fall to the same darkness that had devoured Fredegund. The war of the two queens was over, but the curse they unleashed would haunt the Frankish realm for generations. When Queen Fredegund died in 597 AD, the bells of Soissons tolled without joy. No one wept publicly, yet no one dared to rejoice. Her body, cold and pale beneath the flickering candlelight, was wrapped in royal linen, but those who carried her coffin whispered prayers for protection, as though afraid her spirit might rise and follow them home. Her son, Clotaire too, was barely 4 years old. The boy who had slept beside a queen of daggers now inherited her throne. Around him swirled courtiers who had once trembled under his mother's gaze. They smiled, bowed, and plotted. Neustria had lost its she-wolf, but her cub was still breathing, and her scent of blood lingered in every corner of the court. Fredegund's death should have ended the feud that had poisoned a kingdom. Instead, it marked a new beginning, a quieter, more calculated reign of vengeance. For while Clotaire grew, Brunhild of Austrasia grew old, her hatred for Fredegund's blood unquenched. The two queens had warred with armies. Now their heirs would war with time itself. Chroniclers say that when Clotaire came of age, he carried himself with his mother's same piercing calm, a gaze that made nobles avert their eyes. He restored order to his court with precision and cruelty, often invoking his mother's name when passing judgment. "Let none forget," he once declared, "the price of betrayal paid in my house." It was as if Fredegund's ghost ruled through him. The chronicles of the monk Audenace record that Clotaire rarely spoke of his mother, yet he kept her jeweled dagger beside his throne. He wore her amulet of lapis lazuli when leading campaigns, claiming it brought victory. Some said he prayed to her spirit before battles, not to God, but to the woman who had clawed her way through blood to make him king. In 613, decades after Fredegund's death, her vengeance finally completed its grim circle. The aged Brunhild, the queen who had sworn to destroy her, was captured by Clotaire's men after a failed rebellion. The young king did not see an old woman. He saw the face of his mother's lifelong enemy. He ordered no simple execution. For 3 days, Brunhild was tortured, dragged through the camp tied to the tail of a horse, her body broken and bleeding before the army. On the 4th day, Clotaire commanded that she be torn apart by wild horses. Chroniclers wrote that her screams echoed across the plain until her body was reduced to nothing but shreds of flesh and dust. The soldiers cheered, calling it justice. Yet when the wind shifted, even they fell silent. It was as if the ghost of Fredegund laughed across the field. That day, the feud ended, but not the curse. The Merovingian court would never again know peace. Ministers whispered that Clotaire had become what his mother was, ruthless, suspicious, consumed by shadows. He ruled for decades, uniting the fractured Frankish lands under his iron hand, but his victories tasted of ash. He trusted no one, loved no one, and died alone. Monks who chronicled his final days said he often stared into the fire, murmuring a single phrase, "Mother." They all deserved it. Fredegund's blood had triumphed, and in doing so, had damned its own lineage. Centuries would pass, but the name Fredegund would not fade. Her bones decayed beneath the stone floors of the basilica at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, yet her presence remained like a stain that no sanctified incense could cleanse. Monks prayed over her tomb, but even their psalms sounded uneasy, as if they feared the very air might answer back. They said her spirit still walked the corridors of Neustria's old palace on moonless nights, brushing cold fingers across the walls where her rivals once bled. The scent of lavender and iron, her perfume and her poison, lingered long after the torches died. Some swore they heard her voice whispering to her son's ghost, "Keep the throne warm." But history does not believe in ghosts. It believes in consequences. Fredegund's cruelty had birthed something greater than fear. It had carved a template for power. Every monarch who followed her learned her lesson. Mercy is weakness, and survival demands blood. Kings who came after her invoked her memory when they ordered assassinations or burned heretics alive. In their cruelty, she lived again. The Merovingian dynasty, once destined for divine rule, slowly rotted from within. Intrigue replaced justice. Kin turned against kin. What Fredegund had begun, the slow poisoning of conscience, became the foundation of their downfall. By the 8th century, her descendants had been reduced to puppets, their crowns stolen by the Carolingians. Some chroniclers wrote that the fall of the Merovingians was not political, it was spiritual. The curse of Fredegund had simply run its course. And yet, her story endured. In every chronicle, she was the embodiment of a question that haunted the medieval mind. Can evil ever truly die, or does it merely change its face? Even her greatest enemies could not erase her. Brunhild's line was annihilated. Her lands taken. Her name erased from prayers. But Fredegund's name endured in whispers, not of love, but of awe. She became legend, then myth, then cautionary tale. Mothers frightened disobedient children with her story. Obey, or Fredegund will come for you in the night. Modern historians still argue who she truly was, a victim of circumstance, or a monster shaped by ambition. Some call her a product of her era, when power was a weapon wielded by the ruthless few. Others see something older, darker, a reminder that behind every empire's glory lies a woman's scream buried in the walls. Fredegund's curse was not in her death, but in her remembrance. She had achieved the one thing she desired above all else, to never be forgotten. In the ruins of Soissons, archaeologists once unearthed a fragment of her jewelry, a golden pendant etched with a serpent devouring its own tail. The symbol of eternity. Perhaps coincidence. Perhaps confession. As the historian closes the final chronicle, the candlelight flickers. The ink dries. The voice that has told her story falls silent. Outside, the night remains still. But somewhere in the endless corridors of history, between truth and legend, the echo of Fredegund's laughter survives. For even in death, she won. And that is her curse.